Today I'm here to ask you to stop slavery. You might think that slavery is a thing of the past and it should not exist in the 21st century. But currently there are 40 million people who endure forced employment, and 25% of those are children. 71% of companies indicate there is probably slavery in their supply chains. Slavery is classified in different ways. Economic slaves, who are employed but not able to maintain a livelihood, and traffic slaves, forced migrant labourers, refugees, of which only 2% will ever be rescued. Migrants in particular are at a distinct disadvantage in their new country. They often have their passports taken away and their rights are withdrawn in order to be exploited in the workplace. There are many reasons why slavery occurs, but ultimately the reasons are largely economic, with the majority of slaves being exploited across the world in textiles, agriculture and in sexual trafficking. This slavery is sometimes called modern slavery, and although there are some laws in place in some countries, most are not implemented or enforced. All mass-manufactured brands know the costs of labour in each country. They keep them on a spreadsheet listing the cost of sewing per minute. And these are also published by those countries themselves as a way to attract new investment. Unfortunately, those figures are manipulated by governments themselves to attract business and investment. And those figures are substantially lower than the minimum wage. These wages do not come anywhere near the living wage, therefore workers can barely sustain themselves, let alone their dependents. In many cases, governments themselves are complicit in slavery rather than protecting their own citizens. For example, a bowl of street food in Cambodia or Bangladesh costs approximately 1/3 of the daily wage, and after renting a space to sleep, there is literally nothing left to live on. Workers are being paid half of what they need to live on. We call this economic slavery, and millions of workers are trapped because all the other factories do not pay more. In clothing, this exploitation of the world's poorest people is a result of the downward push on pricing from high street retailers and fast fashion. Retailers are constantly driven to reduce wage cost, resulting in increasingly cheap products as they are competing against each other. Unfortunately, the bonus system of most individuals working in the supply chain is related to increasing profit margins at all costs. Those that suffer the most from this downward pressure are those that least can afford it. It is estimated that by adding just 50 or 60 pence per garment, we could allow the person sewing garments to receive an actual living wage. That's about 2% of profits made by the big fast fashion retailers. I have personally seen the working conditions in facilities across the world, and some are much better than others. The current auditing system does not work, as it has been in place for decades, but has done little to elevate the position of workers in the garment industry. In fact, the value of labour in the supply chain is minuscule compared to the value of the final product. And unless we want to start thinking about the supply chain, this awful scenario will continue. Unpaid overtime is expected, and that's after working 12 to 13-hour days, 7 days a week. The speed of sewing is really important to factory owners too, so often toilet breaks are not taken or prohibited, and workers may have pay deducted if they take too long breaks. They also experience shouting at them to work harder and faster. Although brands do arrange ethical audits, these are always scheduled so that the auditor will see the very best conditions that that factory is working at, and unfortunately the auditors are not checking working conditions unannounced. And unfortunately the whole process is open to corruption. The auditors are also meant to be checking the state of the building itself and the infrastructure. But every week there are fires and building collapses globally, resulting in death and injury. People are literally dying in the process of manufacturing clothing and textiles. 1 in 8 workers globally perform some kind of labour relating to fashion, and 1.6 million are injured every year at their workplace. Many of us celebrate International Women's Day every year, but the day itself started over 100 years ago when workers in the New York garment district were locked into a factory so that they could not strike. And when a fire broke out, many were killed. In fact, the conditions in New York is where we get the term sweatshop. In modern times, many of the sewers are illiterate, and if they join a union, can be sacked. Freedom of association is actually a human right and part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948. Articles 20 and 23 document freedom of association. Some of you will have seen the film Suffragette, where women workers were subjected not only to low wages but also sexual abuse. Recent studies of female garment workers, with one in particular, found that 43% of women workers were subjected to violence and harassment at work in Vietnam. 43% is very high, particularly as there is also a culture of silence, as people are too afraid to speak up in fear of losing jobs and further abuse. Of course, this greatly affects health and well-being, and there is no Me Too movement in these garment workers' lives. Similar figures are found in Bangladesh, Cambodia, India and Sri Lanka, where approximately 1/3 of women garment makers had been abused, raped or slapped in the course of their everyday working lives. Recently, a 21-year-old woman called Jayasir was raped and murdered by her supervisor. She had been working in an H&M factory in Bangladesh, and then 25 of her colleagues came forward to say they had also been abused. How do we know as a consumer citizen that a company lacks transparency in terms of manufacturing and labour? There will be no mention of where the garments are manufactured on the store website. A brand might say designed in the UK or designed in Europe as an effort to make you think the garment is also made there. The brand may mention an ethical facility or family owned, but then not give any further information as to the factory name, location or labour accreditations. And because the brand has been working there for years, this makes no difference, as abuse can go on for a long time. So, what can you do as a citizen before purchasing? Number 1, ask retailers to name their factories on their website. This gives consumers and others the opportunity to check conditions independently. 2, you can seek out organisations set up by the workers themselves rather than big corporations, particularly to preserve handicrafts or heritage textiles. These are often women's cooperatives, so the benefit is shared equally. As entrepreneurs and businesses, how can we ensure that there is no slavery in our supply chain? Firstly, set up your own manufacturing facility complying with international labour standards and certified living wage. Ensure independent monitoring, perhaps with cameras and surprise visits. Facilities should be under their own brand management completely, with the directors coming directly from the retailer and not recruited locally. There must be 24/7 oversight, a commitment to universal union representation and representation in factory meetings. Anti-fraud and anti-corruption measures should also be in place. Install a complaints procedure independently monitored by reputable organisations. Ensure independent wage accreditation. independent auditing and monitoring to forbid subcontracting and end to home working that leads to child labour problems. Independent staff interviews to correct falsifying overtime and rates of pay. Modern slaves do not have their own voice, so we have to be their voice for them. It is our responsibility as the beneficiaries of their labour, and it is up to us to ask for accountability from manufacturers, companies and retailers to demand the same working conditions that we enjoy. A living wage and safeguards from abuse. Ensure workrooms with windows and ventilation. Humane treatment. Freedom from violence and freedom of association and choice to join a union. None of us want to be wearing clothes made by modern slaves. So let's use our voice and vote with our wallets to eradicate this terrible practice once and for all, to put slavery firmly in the past. For further information, you can contact the International Labour Organisation, the Fair Wear Foundation, the Clean Clothes Campaign and Anti-Slavery International.